Hi, I'm Molette Green. Welcome to another program in our ongoing series, Vocal Point. The 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom put the civil rights movement on turbocharge. Issues like voting rights, education, housing, and equal pay garnered national attention and moved in a positive direction. But 50 years later, how far have we really come? Is the Trayvon Martin case and the recent decision by the Supreme Court on voting rights examples of true setbacks or just bumps in the road in the quest to achieve equality for all? Joining us today, Cindy Benavides, Director of Civic Engagement for the League of United Latin American Citizens. Hillary Shelton, President of the Washington Bureau of the NAACP and also a graduate of Howard University. Cynthia Dinkins, President of the Northern Virginia Urban League. And Ryan Ridenour, Digital Media and Communications Manager of Generational Alliance. It was the early 1960s, and the civil rights movement was in full swing.
This country really had a system that was, in my opinion, similar to apartheid in South Africa, in that you had a separation of the races. The buses were integrated, but there were no black bus drivers or streetcar drivers. There were no black men who drove a bread truck or milk truck. So it was a thing about jobs, and I think more importantly, it was about being looked at as a human being.
In 1963, even in DC, there were still some public accommodations that were still segregated. They wouldn't serve you. So I remember walking a picket line to try to desegregate this restaurant out in Suitland, Maryland.
Amid the sit-ins and strain, pickets and pain, national leaders like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and Martin Luther King Jr. planned a national march in Washington, D.C. called the March for Jobs and Freedom. And as August 28, 1963 approached, the air was thick with feelings.
I was excited. I had heard a lot about Dr. King. I had never seen him in person.
There was a lot of talk that there would be rioting, disorder, and so on. And my position was that we don't riot, so if we volunteer, then there won't be riots.
Volunteers and marchers came from all over the country, filling the National Mall from the Washington Monument to the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
Now, I did not get to the Lincoln Memorial, but I got as far as the monument myself. But, you know, I could hear the crowd. I saw people coming in from Chicago on skates, Philadelphia, walking in fatigues, people coming there anywhere, all over the country. It was quite an event for me.
And it was fascinating because, you know, we saw lines and lines and lines of buses. I mean, buses from every place. And when we got there, you know, there were these huge signs, and everybody had signs saying where they were from: Mississippi, Georgia.
Over 200,000 people showed up to lend their voices to the chorus of change. The tone was set by the greatest civil rights leaders of the day.
Well, there were a number of speakers. All of them I thought were outstanding. But we had A. Philip Randolph, who was probably the principal organizer of the march, and he made an excellent speech. And then you had Harry Belafonte, Sidney Poitier. The speech by Dr. King, was the culmination of all of the speeches.
It was transformational, I think. And I saw my city in a different way. I certainly saw the nation in a different way. And I guess I even knew this is something that's going to change the world.
I was optimistic that there was going to be a change. And there was for a time, but I think now we are back in the era of the 63 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
I'm going to the march this year because we've had 50 years. A lot of things have changed and a lot of things haven't changed.
We welcome all of you to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for
having us.
I want to start with sort of setting the tone for expectations 50 years later. In 1963, of course, there was a call for civil and economic rights, a long list of goals. Hillary Shelton with the NAACP in Washington, I want you to start first by telling us the expectations this time around. What is the goal here?
Well, as we move from jobs and freedom, now we have to talk about where we've come, where we are, and what we still have to do. It's a struggle and it's a movement, as we've always seen. So as we talk about this march, we'll be talking about some of the setbacks. For instance, the struggle in '63 was a struggle for voting rights as well. Shelby versus Holder sets back parts of the Voting Rights Act, meaning we have to come back and restore Section 4, as we say, moving along those lines. Violence is still a big issue, and so is employment. Trayvon Martin was just kind of the tip of an iceberg. We know as we look at cities like Chicago and others across the country, we're losing our children at tremendous rates. African American children in Chicago make up 45% of all the juvenile-related homicides, but less than that, about 13% of that population. Same thing across the country. The number one cause of death for 15-year-olds to 19-year-old African American males, gun violence. Those issues are still with us. We're going to have to address those issues moving forward. We also have issues of jobs and job creation. The unemployment rate in the African American community is higher than it was in 1963. And quite frankly, we know we still have those issues to address, and even access to good quality education is still very much with us. So the struggle this time around is to make sure as we move through these paces, we recognize where we are, kind of where we've come from, but that vision ahead. We also know that this is a march to 2014. Mistakes were made during that midterm election in 2010. We made a lot of movement forward in 2008. Elected a president that not only was the first African American president of the United States, perhaps something Martin Luther King himself thought about as he gave that speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. But we also moved to implement an agenda. This speaks very loudly and clearly to the very things Dr. King spoke about on that hot August 28th day in 1963.
The Urban League was there then. The Urban League, of course, very much a part of what we're doing 50 years later. Set the tone.
We are also fighting on education front. You mentioned a workforce. We don't have a skilled workforce. We need, that's across the board. And then people of color, even less. So we have a vigorous program at the National Urban League for job preparedness, education, especially in the area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. It doesn't matter what job you're going to have in the future, you're probably going to have some component of a science or a math in that job. So we're starting as young as third grade, getting kids excited about that, letting them know what the opportunities are, as well as preparing for jobs. Not everyone's a four-year college student. I remember when I was in high school, we had vocational opportunities. So you could go be an engineer, go to do cars, or you could be a cosmetologist. And so we need to identify that. Certificate programs, those type of 2-year programs, and because now the cost of going to a 4-year institution is nearly unattainable for everyone, not just students of color.
And the Latino community, very important component in American population. The numbers are there to be a powerful force in change. Talk about your expectations. Of course, you were not even thought about back then, but of course, very much a part of what is going to be happening, this 50 years later, and of course, in the future.
Absolutely, Molette. When we look at the Latino community, but first when we look at the march, it's realizing that the march was one of the biggest political rallies in the U.S. history that tackled the civil rights and economic integration of African American community, but also realizing as a background with LULAC, it was integrated, it was started in 1929, so we definitely understand some of those same struggles when we were integrating schools in 1945 in Orange County, California, fighting for our Mexican American children to be in those schools, or in Texas and across other states. So it's really looking at the issues of, like I think like Hillary pointed out and Cynthia pointed out, looking at the issues in terms of how far we have come and how much more we have to do. Whether it's the issue of education, whether it's civil rights, looking at Voting Rights Act, where they're asking us to prove citizenship, right? Asking us to prove where we are born and how we're born. So that's something that's very important for us. But then looking really at the unemployment rate and what jobs and the economy mean to us, knowing that the Latino community right now has a 9.4% unemployment rate, higher than the 7.4 national average rate. So it's really digging into these issues. And I think for us, there's also a sense of hope and faith. Because at the end of the day, I think when we bring together people in the march, it shows and demonstrates our faith in democracy.
And never before have we focused on the important component of the youth. I mean, we saw it in the presidential elections, the youth factor there. Very important. Talk about generational alliances, contribution to what we're doing.
Yeah, I think young people have always been on campaigns, you know, doing that volunteer nitty gritty, like in the field work. You know, we just haven't been recognized for that work, or, you know, we really want to make sure that we're uplifting young people's voices because they're on the front lines, right? Like they're the ones who are out in these communities and unsafe and trying to get to college and really just trying to survive. So all of these issues affect young people just in different ways, and we need to really make sure that we're being inclusive of everyone and making this the most diverse and you know, best coalition to go forward so that our demands will be met, right?
One of the goals and issues of importance that you have already mentioned, education. Here is a quote about the 1963 march from Roy Wilkins, who was executive director of the NAACP at that time. Quote, "Negro Americans must march from the congested, ill-equipped schools which breed dropouts and which smother motivation to the well-equipped, integrated facilities throughout the cities." Let's talk about education. And it really is a reality when you talk about the numbers and of young black boys who are missing from college campuses. When you talk about the issues impacting the Latino community and the feeling and sense of hopelessness of many youth. Why should I care about school? How do we need to address this concern and problem and issue?
Well, I would say at a couple of different levels. First, we have to talk about quality education and make sure it's an education that's inviting to the diversity that is America. Too often, we still have a cookie-cutter approach to education policy. What that means is we're not recognizing or moving to teach people where they're at. That's still important in our society. We need a much more integrated curriculum in our schools, and our schools have to be equipped to be able to handle the new technologies. I mean, to teach a class now and not have computer access in the classroom is absolutely unacceptable, and certainly even extending that to our homes as well. We have to talk about the cost of going to college now. I'm a Howardite. I came here and I remember coming here on a Pell Grant. My Pell Grant paid for my entire tuition. I had to take out loans on top of loans to take care of room and board, but at least that was a good start. You can't even begin to do that with a Pell Grant these days.
Let me just read a stat and then I'll let you comment, Cynthia. In fact, at the end of the 1960s, 77% of black students and 55% of Latino students were in segregated schools. Those numbers have not changed much for black students, and they have risen dramatically in the Latino community. 80% of Latino students educated in segregated schools.
One of the things that I want to build upon Hillary is we all know the statistics that those people who build penal systems They look at third grade math and reading scores for young black males. That was a big subject at the National Urban League Conference in Philadelphia this year. So what we're looking to do is to build some type of academy or institute focused strictly for young black males from that 3rd to 5th grade, to give them a breadth of information, not just math, science, but for the cultural arts, because I believe it's exposure. If you don't see someone who looks like you, who's doing something, who's an astronaut, how do you believe you can ever attain that?
Cindy, there are studies that show that young people who have been suspended at least once by 1st grade are 5 times as likely to drop out of high school. And there is evidence that minority students are singled out the most when you talk about suspensions. We've got to really dig deep in fixing this education problem.
Absolutely. And just to give you a quick fact, we know that 1 in 4 children in the public school systems are of Latino background and growing.
Yeah.
And in particular to that point, we know that Congress was looking at HR 5, the Student Success Act, which is something that we oppose because it really it gives oversight and regulation overall of our education system to the local and state level. And when we're looking at the achievement gap, when we're looking at critical issues, which are the STEM fields, when we're looking at a standard common course for our children, whether it's you live in Fairfax, Virginia, or you live in New Orleans, Louisiana, all of our children, a 6th grader in New Orleans and a 6th grader in Virginia, have to have the same standard in that education. But we know particular communities of colors with our Latino children that are language learners, that are coming from migrant workers' families, that have been suspended, that this has a really deep impact. We also know that the parents are less engaged in the school system. Part of that is the language barrier. Part of that is that cultural respect for teachers in the education system. So it's really looking at issues comprehensively, and also knowing that education doesn't start when you get to kindergarten. You have to get ready at home, and parents have to understand that education really starts at home before they even get to pre-kindergarten, before they get to Head Start. And as they go through the education system, they're getting ready to hopefully go on to a higher education system.
You know what the young people are saying. Jump in here.
Well, we believe that education is a right, and we believe that it's the great equalizer. But the education that you get is largely based on where you live and the amount of money you have, and that is not okay. So, I hadn't heard that statistic, and I'm shocked. In terms of education for us, I think what's really important is that we address the school to prison pipeline. I think a couple folks touched on that. But we need to be treating our students, our young people, with the dignity they deserve. We criminalize them before they even do anything, and
it's systematic, it's institutional in this country.
Absolutely,
we've got to get to the root of it.
And I think we're just we're throwing people that we're putting them in alternative or in suspending them and throwing away the key and not really caring about those folks and really writing them off. And minor offenses will land folks who should be in school into juvenile programs or even prison. So we really need to have a real talk conversation about this in our communities.
We could go on and on about education, but we're going to move on to another topic, which is just as important, and that's housing. Whitney Young, who was executive director of the National Urban League, said at the time that Negro Americans must march from the rat-infested, overcrowded ghettos to decent, wholesome, unrestricted residential areas dispersed throughout our cities. Obviously, we can include other minority groups, and of course just the poverty rate of Native Americans, and on and on.
Home ownership. All of that's important too. Good, safe, secure housing, period. But home ownership, look, we took a big hit with the economic downturn. The NAACP warned that a lot of that was coming, testifying
African Americans, Hispanic Americans took the biggest blow.
I sat right next to the National Council of the Raza as we talked about these issues before the Banking Committee, the House, and the Senate as well. So in all those issues, what we see now is we have a 50% loss in African American housing. What that means is we've also lost wealth. Wealth is money that
related.
produces more
Yeah.
money, not just riches, money that produces more money.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm now in a position now, I was lucky enough to keep my house. I've got an 18-year-old that's going off to college, so I'm hocking my house to pay that school tuition. But at least I have a house to do that with. And that's what wealth is all about. So we have to talk about how we restore. We went from 44% of African Americans owning their own homes down to 22%, half. It was cut down to about 65% for even white Americans in our society. So we know that loss has hit us in an incredible way.
We've got to demand better, but we've also have to take the personal responsibility too.
Yes. Sure.
We've got to better educate ourselves
Yes.
about buying homes, about mortgages, about borrowing money, so that we can't get taken.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I mean, are we improving on that front?
Well, for the Urban League, most affiliates have housing programs where they do financial literacy for first-time home buyers, unfortunately for foreclosures, and just getting your credit healthy. And we start as young as possible, because the younger you are and you understand that it is very critical, your credit allows you to do certain things. It levels the playing field, as we were saying about education. So we are big proponents of educating our communities on what you should be able to do and what you should not be, what you cannot do.
Let me just read a stat before I continue on with this. While black poverty rates dropped dramatically between 1959 and 1969 from 55% to 32%, little progress has been made since. And the percentage of black, Native American, and Latino children averages around 25%, while it is 5% for Asians and white.
You know, when I think of housing, I really think of the I Have a Dream from Dr. Martin Luther King, and we have a dream of immigration reform. And we know that immigration reform is tied to housing, right? Because it creates new investors, new buyers. When we think of our youngsters in the Latino community, by the way, which 52,000 Latinos turn 18 every single month, which means they're eligible to register to vote, they're really right now focused on just getting through education, right? Just passing through. I mean, you also see the dynamics in the Latino community where you have Latinos, Hispanics who have been in the country for 6 generations, and then you have Latinos like myself who have been here first generation. So we're learning still about the system and how home ownership happens in America.
Yeah. What's one thing that you want to see happen in terms of getting them there, that needs to happen that's not happening? What's one big stumbling block?
Financial literacy.
Yeah.
So understanding financial
There we go.
literacy.
Okay.
We'll talk.
Young people.
I was in a program recently for young people of color, young queer folks and women who are change makers in their communities. And we are doing a power, privilege, and oppression exercise where we were looking at each other, but also like stepping forward and stepping back. And they asked, so how many of you expect to have a home, you know, hope to inherit a home? And
Inherit
a home. And nobody, really nobody in the entire room. And that's when it hit me, like, this is a huge problem, right? And it will come with financial literacy, it definitely will, and somebody said this to me recently, like, how can we expect for young people to focus on financial literacy when we can't even like be out in the street without being harassed, or we can't even, you know, there are a lot of things that we can't do right now that we need to get past to be able to get to that place where we can start being like, oh, well, let me plan for my future and not just like, let me get through this day, or let me like get through this paycheck or whatever, right? So I think it's hard to excuse me, think so long term when we're not even sure about the short term.
Yeah. I look forward to continuing our discussion, but now let's take a look at what some Howard University Law School students have planned for the 2013 March on Washington.
My name is Edward Hill, and I'm currently a third-year law student at Howard University School of Law. When I think about the march 50 years ago, we as African Americans have made a lot of progress, particularly in the areas of voting rights. However, with the recent case of Shelby v. Holder, there are more challenges to go, and therefore that's why I, as a student, want to participate in the March on Washington. So the Trayvon Martin case was another blow to the African American community. We saw a young boy be killed as he was walking to his home. The Stand Your Ground laws is an issue that we as African Americans face. It's a law that we need to focus on as far as changing, but it's important to note that Zimmerman was cleared of his crime in the court setting, but he's still, you know, a guilty man in our eyes. Well, currently I serve as president of the Student Bar Association at Howard University School of Law. And I felt that it's important that as a university who's leading for the fight for social justice, that Howard University is present at the March on Washington. I expect to feel the excitement of being around so many people, some people who were even at the March on Washington years ago. I expect to be around like-minded individuals who are continuing to fight for social justice. As far as the people who marched 50 years ago, first of all, I would thank them for their commitment and for even coming out and serving as they have. I think that's a big thing to acknowledge, the presence of people and their support in the March on Washington. So if I had to let them know how I felt, it would be to thank them.
Jobs, that's what we're going to talk about now. John Lewis, who was then the chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and is now a U.S. Congressman from Georgia, had this to say about jobs at the March on Washington. We march today for jobs and freedom, but we have nothing to be proud of. For hundreds and thousands of our brothers are not here, for they are receiving starvation wages or no wages at all. And let me bring in some statistics now. The unemployment gap between whites and African Americans has stayed virtually the same since 1963. And in 2013, African Americans have a significantly higher rate of unemployment, we've talked about it, than any other racial group. Jobs, jobs, jobs. It's always the topic of discussion when we're talking about politics and going to the polls.
As a matter of fact, we have to talk about where it begins, and particularly in the African American community, a little bit about the Latino community as well. But one of the biggest challenges is if you look at the unemployment rate in our communities, it is actually exponentially higher for young men that should be able to get into starter level positions. That 18 to 24-year-old crowd are totally locked out. As a matter of fact, if you go into many inner city areas, St. Louis, Missouri, my hometown, Cincinnati, Ohio, and a few others, you'll find that the unemployment rate of that same group of African American males is at 50% and higher. 50% and higher.
Yeah.
At a time you should be entering the workforce, beginning to build your way up, and hopefully being able to have a family later on and the kind of resources to support it. The political will is what we're missing, and that's where the real push has to happen during this march as well. Our President, Barack Obama, introduced a bill, or had Congress introduce a bill called the American Jobs Act. This is one of those private-public partnerships in which the federal government kicks in and it gives some incentives to private industry to do the same thing. 1 million jobs will be created over a 2-year period if we had that kind of coordination. But for some reason, there's no political will to do that, and quite frankly, on Capitol Hill, not too much else.
The one thing that young people get slammed on is this sense of entitlement. I need to come into the job force and be the manager, you know. And then you have this whole issue of the generational gap and the whole thing.
As a young person, right, there's some narratives.
Yeah.
There's we're lazy and apathetic and we don't care, right? But there's also the we want your jobs, we don't care about hierarchy, we're coming in
Sure.
and whatever, right?
Yeah.
So I just feel like there's competing narratives about young people, and a lot of them don't really consider young people at all. I mean, all my friends are running for office, running organizations in this room, you know, they care. And maybe sometimes they might come off a little, you know, gung-ho and really excited, but you know, they're willing to work hard. I see people work hard every day and they're all young.
Yeah, but one of the issues, when we're talking about jobs, and we can't ignore the reality of what women, the pay equity, and what women are paid compared to men, and what minority women are paid compared to white women. It is astounding. And a recent study of African American women polled. These women are in very good jobs. They're educated women. And they know that they are not being paid what they are worth. And we're still in 2013, these women have said they're too afraid to even demand more. We've got a problem in America when we're afraid to demand what we're worth.
Absolutely.
Because of fear of losing your job.
We have to know what rights, we have. So if someone fires you and it's not documented, that you have a right to appeal that. So again, it's an advocacy and it's an education for all women, young, old, black, white.
So in terms of thinking of the community, I think, and thinking really of how we look at the march and jobs and looking at these critical issues, it's also how do we think smartly, right? How do we reach the different communities in the language that they understand?
Absolutely.
For many of us, it may be Instagram, it may be Facebook, it may be Twitter, and I'm afraid I'm taking away from you, Ryan.
Okay,
but
thank you.
it's also when I look at the Latino community, and our community is so diverse in age and language is Spanish, but in national ethnicities, it's also how are we strategically targeting those communities to take action.
All right, we need to move on to one of the most important topics, of course, voting. The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Mentioned voting in his now famous I Have a Dream speech delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial 50 years ago. Quote, "We cannot be satisfied as long as a colored person in Mississippi cannot vote and a colored person in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote."
Absolutely.
Let's start the conversation on the issue, the very important issue of voting, and continuing to keep people galvanized, and not just during the presidential election, but during the midterm election, and understanding the importance of even just picking your school board member, the right persons all the way up to the top. Very important to keep the energy going. Can we keep the Latino community galvanized?
We're definitely fighting on immigration front. So we know that in 2012, we voted for the candidate because of the economy, jobs, and immigration was right there next to that. And one of the reasons, Moled, is because immigration is so personal to us. 7 out of 10 Latinos are personally impacted by immigration themselves, or they know somebody that is impacted by immigration. So really looking, right now I think the Latino community is looking at, is Congress acting? And if not, do we need to remind them again? In 2012 we voted more than 11 million, but there's a caveat. More than 12 million Latinos did not vote, right? So many of us, our percentage rate in terms of voting is less than 50%. So it's really seeing how we galvanize our community across every election cycle and seeing if it's the matter of a candidate. We overwhelmingly supported President Obama both in 2008 and 2012. But it's also the issues and how the different parties are really embracing us and really keeping that at play.
Absolutely.
Well, we've awakened the sleeping giant. I'm very proud of the African American community as we've watched the increase in voter participation going back to 2000 and that Bush-Gore election. What we saw happen in the last 2 elections, however, 2008, more African Americans turned out to vote than ever before in the history of the country. It was wonderful to see, and it was being led by our young people. Again, that 18 to 24-year-old grouping. In 2012, for the first time in history, the African American community outpaced the white American community in voter participation.
Astounding.
It was a wonderful thing to say. But what you're saying, what you're saying is absolutely accurate. That is, 2008 we turned out in big numbers. 2010 we thought the job was done and set back. We saw a shift in the Congress that actually began to move to repeal everything that we've been able to win just 2 years earlier. 2012 we come back, things go very well and whatnot in terms of voter participation and turnout, but we're looking at 2014. And the question is this going to end up being just one long lame duck session, or are we going to be able to get our agenda through? And that's going to depend on just how wide awake we are moving into this 2014 election. That's one of the things that we're really focusing on for this march as well. The march isn't just to Washington, it's to what happens when we leave Washington,
Absolutely.
going back into our communities, our towns, our hamlets, our villages.
When you look back at the video and the speeches, the energy is palpable, at least from our perspective looking at the tape. And if you talk to people who were there, they talk about the emotion, the energy in the air, and the expectations. Do we still have that same energy enough to push us to step on the necks of our representative, our elected officials? Is it there to demand better to demand more? Or are we in this feeling and sense of hopelessness or complacency that allows the situation to just languish? Where are we with that?
Unfortunately, I think a lot of us are in the latter because they feel our vote doesn't matter. Or how do I get in touch with my representative? I'm from Virginia. We have a critical gubernatorial election that could really make or break our state for the next, not just 4 years, but beyond. As urban leaguer, I'm nonpartisan. As a Virginian, I'm very concerned about the candidates, so I'll leave it at that. But another thing we do is advocacy and really work with our communities, our churches, so people understand your vote does matter. And we should know that from the election several years ago in Florida. So we just need, and I try to tell young people, if you're 18, you've got to vote. You have to vote.
At the time of the 1963 march, states across the country tried to suppress minority voting with poll taxes, literacy tests, and physical violence. Today, we have voter ID laws. Currently, 11 states have medium to very strict photo ID laws. 19 states have ID laws that don't necessarily have to be photo IDs. And 20 states, as well as Washington, D.C., have no voter ID requirements. And I read a very interesting article, a young lady, 92 years of age, who fought to vote in the Jim Crow South, North Carolina. And North Carolina just passed one of the strictest voter ID laws in the country. And now she says she had to go through passing literacy tests back then to now facing the possibility of not voting, because basically your valid photo ID has to perfectly match your voter registration card. And a lot of minorities working hard every day, African Americans, Latinos, don't have the time, don't have the finances to go and correct that or fix that. And so there is this, that one example, but there is this, this dug in desire and effort to stop the voting. 50 years later, we're still talking about these efforts, people.
Well, absolutely. If I could just begin by saying, you know, we thought we buried Jim Crow a long time ago. Those are old Jim Crow laws.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, the NAACP took great pride, as a matter of fact, and even symbolically putting that coffin in the ground and throwing dirt on top of it. But what we learned is that old Jim Crow piece may have died, but James E. Crow Esquire is alive and well and more insidious than ever before. It's a new approach to how these things are being done.
And I would say when we look at voter suppression, it's looking at voter suppression as a crime against democracy, because it's impeding us from participating. And I think, you know, as we think of going to the booth and voting, when we think of the proving citizenship, the voter ID, the long lines, the voter purges, all of these things add up, right? And also denying folks to be able to vote on the same day or do early voting. But another thing that I think is critical for our community is to start moving forward, running for office. Running for office, to be in the trenches, fighting these fights right there with other elected officials. And whether you start as a board appointee, right, you serve on a board on the local, state level and gain that experience and move on to run for elected office. We need so many more Latinos, Asians, LGBT, African Americans running for all levels of elected office, and we need to see them everywhere. We're so happy to see President Obama because he is a person of color and we are able to reflect upon him. Now we're really thrilled and hoping that we will see a Latino president one day as well, representing America.
Absolutely. We need to make voting sexy. We need to make it cool.
I like that.
We need to make it like the thing that young people are doing. It's cool. Like get on board, vote. And we really need to make it fun. Like last year, the Generational Alliance did a ton of vote work, get out the vote work, nonpartisan, of course. But we were on FAMU's campus and we threw a party. Like we threw a party. We had food, we had drinks, like we just had people at the polls hanging out, college students. We're just there and we were talking about the issues, we were talking about who they were voting for, and it was amazing. And we should be doing that in all of our communities. And through coordination, through all of our groups, like we can do that. We can protect the right to vote.
I want to talk about, before we get off this topic, the Supreme Court decision to strike down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act and what the impact of that could be. I mean, basically, states with a history of racism were required to get permission, if you will, from the federal government before changing any kind of election laws. And so, where do we go from here? Where do we go from here, Hillary?
Well, on Capitol Hill, of course, we're already struggling to put together Section 4B. That's just, our legal way of saying we've got to fix the section that was struck down by the Supreme Court. They did a roundabout attack on voting rights. We all thought they were going to go after Section 5, the pre-clearance section itself, the one that says before you can make any changes to the time, place, or manner in which an election is carried out, because of your sorry history of racial discrimination and other forms of discrimination, you have to have it pre-approved. It's just good sense, because once election day comes, it's too late to make any changes then. So this is a very smart approach. What the Supreme Court said is that even though we went through the process in 2006, where thousands of NAACPers went to Capitol Hill, in 2006, we held about 21 hearings, over 52 witnesses. We had over 17,000 pages of testimony, very thoroughly done, even in districts across the country. And even after that, and a bipartisan support, 98 members of the U.S. Senate voted for it, 2 were absent. Only 33 of the 435 members of the House of Representatives voted against it. In essence, it was a bipartisan support, and George Bush signed it into law. Yeah. But for some reason, they decided that wasn't enough and it hadn't been modernized enough. So that's how the Supreme Court came around back to the point that even Republican members of the Congress, and we're nonpartisan too at the NAACP, even Republican members of the Congress are outraged that the Supreme Court moved to actually usurp the authority of the U.S. Congress. Yeah. So under those circumstances, we've got to fix it. We're happy that the Attorney General has already announced they'll be redoubling their efforts, putting more resources into providing additional ways of providing that kind of protections, since we're losing the pre-clearance section until we actually reauthorize or until we actually repair that particular provision. All right. So we have to be very diligent. We want to make sure people are sending in stories. If you're seeing things of voter discrimination, we need to know. We need to build that record now. And we need people to volunteer to be poll working observers. We want people watching what's going on and being able to report those things so we can stop this kind of discrimination before it happens.
We've got to act, we've got to galvanize, and we've got to get active.
Absolutely.
Now we want to hear from our audience and see what they have to say about the march then and now. There's a young lady here who was there in 1963, am I right?
That is correct.
What's your name? And what do you want to say?
Okay, good evening. My name is Sarah Davidson. I came from North Little Rock, Arkansas in 1963. I was a teenager. I was president of the North Little Rock NAACP Youth Council. Why do you think the youth are not involved to the extent today that they were in 1963?
All right, let me go over here to
I don't see that.
Younger side of the panel.
I mean, I've seen the Dream Defenders occupy the Florida State House for the last 25, 26 days, so I don't see young people being less involved. Every single one of my friends has their eyes on Florida right now, waiting to see what happens, like we're all waiting and hoping. I think that maybe you don't see us, maybe we're not there with you in that room, but we're organizing and we're doing really great work. And I think all of us in this room are tied to the same struggle, right? And we all want the same thing.
And I can't say that I have gone through too much because I want to say I'm around 30. But I can tell you, we're trying at LULAC to find a way of how do we engage our collegiate LULACers more, right? And it's having them be part of the national board. It's making sure that when we're coming up with a plan that involves them, that they're actually at the planning table, right? Because then they take ownership of this. We cannot dictate to them what to do. So we have to ask them, what is it that you bring to the table?
What's your name and what's your question?
Yes, I'm Delegate Aisha Braveboy, and I'm chair of the Legislative Black Caucus of Maryland. And thank you so much for having us here this evening. My question is regarding Detroit. I want to ask those who are on the panel what your views are on the national significance on the bankruptcy filing in Detroit and the impact it will have on the workers of Detroit and the community, and why, if you believe that we as a nation need to be concerned about that and how that will play into the upcoming march.
I can start by saying that a couple of things about Detroit. First, to see the move to actually create a kind of a receivership over Detroit and take the power away from local officials to be able to make decisions really works against home rule and shouldn't be able to happen at all. But the only thing more outrageous than that is a bill was moving on Capitol Hill that we just had to go in and address just before the Congress went on recess. It was a bill saying that any city or municipality that finds itself in the same situation Detroit is, we want to cut off all federal resources to them as well. So they're out to get Detroit in a way like never before. Detroit, as you know, was the gem of African American run cities in our country, and certainly one of the most powerful bases for so many things, including the largest NAACP chapter. We have to make sure that we stop that from moving forward the way that it is. We have to attack these issues on the level that we should and make sure that at the state level, where most of these fights are happening now, that we engage ourselves in the Michigan State Legislature as well and show our outrage across the country. Because the bottom line is, what happens in Detroit now will happen in so many other major cities, particularly those with very healthy racial and ethnic minority populations.
Hello there, what's your name?
Faye Williams, chair of the National Congress of Black Women, and most of these good-looking people in the first 3 rows are with me.
We see the shirts.
we heard Hillary say that we made a mistake in 2010. Well, 98% of us voted right in 2012. What can we do? What's the most important thing we can do to make sure we continue to vote the right way and that we are voting with other people who have issues that we ought to be supporting too?
Absolutely. We have to truly be accountable and follow up after the elections, right? It doesn't stop there. And see, hey, are you supporting me on this issue, whether it's housing, which is a platform to so many other issues, whether it's immigration, whether it's something else in the community. But I would just add that one of the things that each one of us can do as citizens is peer pressure our network. It is peer pressuring our network. And I tell you, my mom, although she is a permanent resident, she knows her godmothers and her children, her godchildren, and she will call them and say, are you registered to vote? Are you voting on November 6th?
Yes.
And really educate them. Let me tell you, my mom may not be eligible to register to vote, but she has a black book and she will take it out. So I think really, doing that peer pressure, whether we post it on the social media, whether it's us picking up the phone, whether it's around the dinner table, whether it's when we're hanging out at the movies with our friends, whether it's at the church, that we really are asking our friends, right? Because there's nothing like asking and peer pressuring our friends. Are you going to vote?
And I'll go with you to the polls. Come on, let's go together. I'll drop you off if we're not at the same precinct. But where we fail sometimes too, Ryan, is we don't really know the issues. We're not as educated about who is this person? What do they represent? They may look like me, but do they represent my values? Are they going to support what I support? We've got to get educated.
Yeah, that's real. Like if you, not many people can easily just access voter information like that. It's not intended to be easy to access. And so I think that really you'll see a lot during this election cycle that the digital world is going to amp up.
Yes.
And we're going to start really driving home, like voter reg, get out the vote, social tool like social media plugins so that you can see which of your friends have voted, stuff like that. Like we're gonna really be going hard this next election cycle.
Hello there.
Hello, good evening. My name is Mark Booker. Thank you for Vocal Point. In 1963, public education was a critical issue, particularly on the heels of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. What is the impact is the Brown decision from 1954 to current? The 1954 Brown decision, in fact, impacted public education in a major way. What impact do you think that the march has now on the Brown decision?
It absolutely has to be clearly engaged. And listen, we've watched what's happening with integration of our schools. From 54 to 74, we actually reached a point in which almost every child in America was being educated in an integrated school. But we also saw a movement among the Congress and local legislators to begin cutting funding for things like school busing programs and anything else that would integrate us. As a matter of fact, we moved now to a point where we're almost back to being as segregated as we were in 54.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality in America. The quality of our schools has to be key. Again, we have to put our values ahead of everything else. So as we move through this march, we need more resources for public schools. We have to recognize how so many communities have been decimated because of the big economic downturn. Most of the resources that are utilized to pay for public schools come from property taxes, but we know because of the mortgage foreclosure crisis, a lot of homes are empty and those property taxes aren't being paid. But we have to make sure the priority still remains with the future, and the future of America is directly tied to our public education system.
All right, we're going to move on to the next question in the audience.
Yes.
Hello there.
How you doing? I'm Dr. Troy Spencer Grant. I have a question. It sounds like we're talking about some great things that happened in 1963. However, there's a corollary that I also hear we talk about what needs to happen now. So my question is, what did not happen in 1963 that we are here again, 50 years later, having these conversations?
Yeah. I want you to take that.
Well, since I was about 3 years old, one of the things I think we took our foot off the pedal as far as moving forward. You know, we settled. We settled for what we got in housing and education. And now we see unfortunately, it's not a level playing field. You know, we have less and less students of color going into a higher education. And once you do, you get out and you don't get a job that's a living wage type of job. So I don't think it's something that we did not do, but I think even now, even more so now, we have to really keep our foot on the metal, and we have to demand our rights.
I think that's a very key point, and that's why I keep going back to our the importance of our youth, the importance of the diversity of America, the browning of America, in making sure that we continue or we move it forward. We not only have our foot on the pedal, but we're going forward. Yes, young lady.
Yes, how are you? I'm Walla Blagay, and I want to thank you all for having me at this program today. I wanted to ask about reentry programs. We know that this is very, very important, especially because of we have such high numbers of minorities in the prison system, especially African American numbers are high, and that when the inmates come out, they don't have places to go and work, and this is a big contribution to this unemployment number that we look at today.
That is one of the key points at the National Urban Leagues, and we have 94 affiliates in 34 states in the District of Columbia. So we had our national convention about 3 weeks ago, and the National Urban League was awarded a significant grant from DOJ and Department of Justice, to address just that. So when people are coming out of the prison system, how can we engage them and train them so they can transition into the workforce? So that is very high on our priority, and I believe that we are partnering with the NAACP to make sure that we meet those needs. And there are even more women of color coming out of the penal system that need to be prepared. It used to be just men, but now the number has really jumped, tripled possibly, of women coming out of the system.
Well, the Second Chance Act was a very important piece of legislation we helped move to provide resources for just these kinds of programs. But we're having to have some very interesting fights right now. As much as we got bipartisan support to pass the Second Chance Act, we've got members of Congress actually introducing legislation to cut off resources for some of the most basic programs to assist those coming out of jail. Food stamps. Senator Vitter from Louisiana introduced an amendment to the Farm Bill that actually disallows anyone that's been convicted of a violent crime from ever receiving food stamps as they come out of prison. What that means is that the most basic resource you need is being cut out. We're also working with the Justice Department to move a number of other issues that are important as well. There's some artificial barriers to full re-entry for those who have served time in our prisons. As you know, 2.4 million Americans in jails and prisons right now. 40% are African American, but we also know they're coming out in waves of 600,000 per year. We want to make sure we're prepared for them in every kind of way, including eliminating these obstacles like not allowing them to get plumbing license or beautician's license in some states.
The fight continues. The fight continues. Yes, ma'am.
I listened well this evening, and I know my husband, who was Ed Hales with the NAACP. We came here for the March on Washington. That's why I live here now. But I tell you, if we as minorities do not embrace our problems ourselves,
yes,
with our children whom we love dearly, we will continue. And we address Florida. There are 30 states in this union that has the stand your ground.
Yes,
30 states. We can't do it all, but what we can do, we must do, friends, for our young. It's for those like Ed. And other families who were here for the march and knew what had happened and see us going down. I know he's deceased. He must be turned over many times to see what has happened in our country today. But I believe if it is to be, it's up to me.
Yes. Thank you so much. Great. Now we want to move into some final thoughts, some comments. Congressman John Lewis said 50 years later, this is not a post-racial society. We still have many challenges. I want you to talk about your expectations, what has to happen, just some final thoughts as we celebrate 50 years. And be very brief. Ryan, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, I'll just say that I think the last 50 years has meant that we moved from explicit, overt racism, sexism, homophobia into now implicit and institutionalized. So what we need to do now is continue to share our stories, continue to get them out there and make sure that people know the realities that we all face.
Cindy.
I would say when we look at 1963, I have a dream. Many of those dreams have not been fulfilled, and there's a lot of work for us to do. But I think it's also working across, right? It's not only about Latinos, it's not only about African Americans, it's how can we work together, right? The new majority, how can we work together in making progress and pushing those issues? Because all of these issues we have as a common denominator. So it's how can we work across the board with our brothers and sisters, regardless of ethnicity.
And I'd like to just add on to what Cindy said, and I'm quite encouraged. I'm very encouraged because more young people are getting involved, and then they see their grandparents and their great-grandparents involved. And as long as organizations such as ours on the stage, we stay in the community and we encourage, I'm very encouraged. I'm very encouraged, and I hope to see all of you out there at the march, because I'll be out there along with my brothers and sisters on the panel.
That's right.
Well, this march is not just about commemoration, it's about rededication. We're rededicating ourselves to the challenge and the struggle and the movement to finish a job that was started then. Dr. King laid out a great vision. That great vision has to be the roadmap. We have to begin to move through here, and it's not just what happens on the 24th on the Mall, it's what we do after that as we move towards 2014.
Thank you very much. Well said. Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. And thanks to our audience. We hope that you've enjoyed this very stimulating conversation about the March on Washington then and now. We hope that you have learned something and are inspired to keep this dialogue going, as well as the activism. To learn more about this program or others in our series, please go to our website, www.whut.org. I'm Millette Green. We'll see you next time on Vocal Point, right here on WHUT TV. Thank you.